Alright, this is the second video for the Japanese actions. We're trying to wrap this up. So I left off in the first video saying that in September of 1940, Japan invades French Indochina, and the United States responded by imposing economic sanctions, reducing exports of oil, iron, scrap metal. The United States also made it clear that further Japanese aggression in the region would result in much tougher sanctions. So this is moving Japan to having to make a decision on that strike north, strike south option. And in April of 1941, they're going to roll out the strike north option because April 13th, 1941, the Japanese-Soviet Neutrality Pact is signed. And so strike north, strike south, those disputes are being resolved. This neutrality pact will eventually end the Soviet-Japanese border war that's been going on since 38-39. The Japanese are now starting to move to prepare for war with Britain, United States, and the Netherlands. And this will allow the Soviet Union to withdraw troops from East Asia in order to resist the Germans who had invaded them in June of 1941. And so July of 1941, Japan held a conference. They decided on significant expansion into Southeast Asia and the Pacific, even if that meant war with the West. And July 28th, 1941, a large Japanese army moved into southern Indochina. The United States is going to respond with this with much tougher action than in 1940. They immediately imposed a total ban on vital supplies such as oil, iron, and aircraft to Japan, and they froze all of the Japanese assets in the United States. This is what's going to help push Japan, and decided to extend its greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere in order to have access to those supplies of oil and rubber in the Dutch East Indies. The United States controlled Philippines and British Malaysia, and so they started to plan these simultaneous attacks on these territories held by the United States and the Dutch. On Sunday morning of December 7th, 1941, the Japanese are going to launch these attacks. They argued, or the Japanese thought, that they might be able to get some help from the Asian nations that are part of the Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere. That this would be a chance, if they aided the Japanese armies, this would be a chance to gain independence from the Western powers. Japan also assumed that if they could deliver a knockout blow to the United States, that the Americans would agree to accept further Japanese expansion into Southeast Asia. They achieved initial success as far as what their goals were. They were able to knock the United States back. They were able to gain quite a little bit of land there for about the first 6 months after Pearl Harbor. But after the United States enters World War II on December 8th, 1941, and after those 6 months are over, it was becoming increasingly apparent to the Japanese that the United States were only going to be temporarily inconvenienced by this attack. And what we'll see end up happening after June of 1942 is that this Greater East Asia War, or the War of the Pacific as we call it, will turn into a war of attrition. And this is the war that the Japanese economy could not sustain. And fortunately for the Americans, this is one that they could fight and will end up winning. We will go on to the next lecture, and get into international responses to Japanese expansion, as long as I have some time here. So let me get that up for you. Alright, so this will cover the last of Japanese expansion in East Asia, 1931 to 1941. And this will look at international responses to Japanese expansion. So we have a couple things here. For every action, there's an international response. So for the action of the invasion of Manchuria in northern China, right, how did the League of Nations respond to that? For the Second Sino-Japanese War, what was the international response to that? looking at the Second United Front, the Sino-Soviet Treaty, so on. And then for the Tripartite Pact and the attacks in the Pacific, we see the Nine-Power Treaty Conference and the U.S.-Japanese tension increasing, and finally it will result in that attack on Pearl Harbor and the U.S. response after that. So the first one is, how did the League of Nations respond to Japanese expansionism? And this deals with the crisis over Manchuria. And I say that the Great Depression caused many countries to seek out expansionist foreign policies, and this is going to cause a lot of problems for the League. The Manchuria incident was a pretty difficult situation for the League of Nations in several ways. Number one, China and Japan were both members of the League. Great Britain and France both had colonies in Asia, and they were determined to safeguard their interests. And this is the first real challenge for the League since it had been formed in 1920. And the failure for them to adequately respond, or to create a response to this Japanese aggression in Manchuria, is going to be noted by Mussolini and Hitler. And they saw this League of Nations response to Manchuria as an indication that Great Britain and France were not prepared to take serious joint action to prevent any sort of expansionist foreign policy. And this is, in the face that, in the situation that Japan was clearly the aggressor, and that China, and I think reasonably so, China expected the League to order Japan to halt their occupation and to withdraw those forces. What the League decides to do instead is they are quick to respond to the suggestion made by Japan's government that a commission of inquiry should be established to investigate. This will be called the Lytton Commission. It's headed up by Britain's Lord Lytton, has France, Italy, Germany, and even the United States, and they're gathering information. They present the report to the League in October of 1932. Unfortunately, by that time, the Japanese army had occupied even more of Manchuria. In fact, by March of 1932, the Japanese had renamed it Manchukuo. The findings here is that the Japanese military had not been in self-defense. They did accept the Japanese argument that Chinese instability affected Japan's economic interest in there, and that they recommended, the conclusion of this report is that Japan should withdraw their soldiers from Manchuria and officially recognize Chinese sovereignty, and that that the League would not or should not recognize Manchukuo as an independent country. This report was adopted by all the members in the League in February of 1933 by 42-1 vote. So I shouldn't say all the members in the League, because that one was Japan. Japan did not accept the conclusion there. Japan refused any compromise with the Chinese. They voted against the League of Nations findings, like I said, and they officially withdrew from the League in the following month. Their delegation walked out, and they were out. This is a critical turning point for the League of Nations, and like I said before, really encouraging to those like-minded nations of Germany and Italy. All right, the second event that we want to look at would be reactions to the Sino-Japanese War. So when we're looking at Japan's invasion of China in 1937, we want to go back and Manchuria had provided Japan with that geographical and strategic position, which they are now able to start to extend their influence and conquest into China. And we talked about earlier that Japan's actions against the mainland of China had begun as early as January of 1932 with that first Shanghai incident. China appealed to the League in 32, no avail. Japan eventually launches that all-out war in July of 1937 after that Marco Polo Bridge incident. September of 1937, China appealed to the League again. The response was the same as the Manchurian incident, pretty much nothing. the only thing that the League of Nations essentially did was in October of 37, the League issued a statement giving China its quote-unquote spiritual support, but no effective action was taken. And we talked about some of this was because Great Britain and France were now preoccupied with Germany and Hitler. And Hitler's over there occupying the Rhineland by 36. And in 37, he's continuing to try to undermine those peace settlements of Paris from 1919 to 1920. So what are some other things that we see happening here with reactions to the Second Sino-Japanese War? We do see the Chinese and Soviets sign a non-aggression pact in September of 1937. We see that Stalin's going to because the Japanese had signed that anti-Comintern pact with Germany, Italy, and Japan in 36, and Japan was gearing up for maybe that Strike North campaign. Stalin decided to help out the Chinese. This included sending military aid and sending the Soviet Volunteer Air Force to support the GMD armies, and we know that those clashes between the Soviets and Japanese will start up in 38 and 39, and eventually end with that Neutrality Act in 41. Another response to the Second Sino-Japanese War would be that Second United Front, which I had talked about quite some time, or quite a lot, and we know that this would be a GMD-CCP joint effort, and the Civil War is going to be largely set aside for right now, and we'll pick back up after World War II ends in 1945. So the responses to the Three Power Pact, or the Tripartite Pact, and the Pacific Attack by the Japanese in 41. So a couple things that we want to talk about with the Tripartite Pact. Remember, that's that military defensive alliance between Germany, Italy, and Japan. So a couple of things here. In response to the Sino-Japanese War, we see a 9-power treaty conference planned out by Britain. This is a response to FDR, Franklin Roosevelt's quarantine speech in 37. FDR in this quarantine speech, he equates the aggression that we see in not only Asia but in Europe at this time to an epidemic. And what do doctors and medical professionals do? And this is source D, by the way, in that packet. What do they do to when an epidemic happens? They quarantine the infected patients to keep the rest of the community safe. So that's FDR saying we have to quarantine or isolate these aggressors, all right, and not let them expand anymore. And so as a result of this, we see the 9-power treaty conference in 37. It's connected to the results of the 9-power treaty from the Washington Naval Conference. It's supposed to help out China, but it doesn't really take any action. It really doesn't say much of anything, and United States, and Great Britain and France continue to go along their way. U.S.-Japanese tension, where is that coming from? The U.S. does respond in part to this Sino-Japanese War. In 39, they're giving loans to China, but at the same time, they're also negotiating trade agreements with Japan. So, how much are they really responding to Japanese aggression? They're not doing anything with this 9-power treaty conference. They're trading with both the China and Japan. But the pivotal point here is when Japan decides to start to move south or head south. We know that in 40, they're going to have that partial ban or those economic sanctions on those vital supplies. And then July of 1941, when Japan launches that larger force into French Indochina, they're going to announce that trade ban. They're going to freeze the Japanese assets in response to this invasion of Indochina in July of 1941. And this will lead to that attack on Pearl Harbor. December 7th, Japan attacks Pearl Harbor. December 8th, the Japanese attack the Dutch East Indies, and the United States declare war on Japan. And December 11th, Germany and Italy, as part of their fulfillment of the Tripartite Pact, declare war on the United States. We will pick up with German and Italian expansion. with our discussion after spring break. Thanks a lot.